All right, good morning, everyone. It's Mark Freezin here at Vantage Point. We're going to get this webinar underway. This is Board Fundamentals, Roles and Responsibilities, brought to you by us here at Vantage Point in partnership with Gymnastics BC. A big thank you for taking time out of your day to attend this session. This is a very important, and for us, we like to think exciting topic. Board governance does not often come top of mind when one thinks of exciting, engaging, or exciting sessions, workshops, or webinars, but I'd like to think that this topic and the content and approach that we are going to outline here today are going to be exciting and of interest to everyone. But a big thank you for taking time out to explore this important topic. So my name is Mark Freezin. I'm the consulting manager here at Vantage Point. A little bit of background from myself. I do know many of you from the gymnastics community. I was executive director at Delta Gymnastics for a number of years, and before that with Prince George Gymnastics. And have also been pretty involved in the Kids Can Move program, as well as the Gymnastics for All committee at sort of a provincial level. I've been with Vantage Point for just over a year now, and joined the team here after going back to Simon Fraser University to do my master's, focused on governance. If anyone has follow-up questions after today's webinar or during, pop me a question via email. My email address is here, and also my contact. My handle on Twitter, if folks want to follow up that way in a more public format. Always hopeful and encouraged at any questions around society governance, board governance, topics relating to strategic planning or board development overall. It's a great and important topic for societies in any sector, including sport and gymnastics. Also at the top of your page, you've got the Twitter handle for Vantage Point. If there are questions during the webinar that you want to post on Twitter publicly, go ahead and do so. We won't be answering them during the webinar, but we'll endeavor to do so afterwards if you'd like to share your questions and the following answer. And also, again, via email, I'll be sure to follow up afterwards. A few technical items before we dive into this topic. First of all, there's no webcam, so don't expect to be seeing me during this webinar. We are recording the webinar, and Gymnastics BC is going to make sure it's available for clubs after today's session. So if you'd like to review it again, or you have others in your organization on the board or staff that you'd like to share this webinar with, you'll have a tool to do so. This webinar in particular, this is one of 3 webinars we've arranged in partnership with Gymnastics BC. And this one especially is pretty heavy on the interactive side. So I've got 4 polls lined up for today, so we can learn, get a bit of feedback on where everyone is currently in relation to this topic, board governance overall, and the functioning of the board and the role of the board overall. But we also have, and I'm going to get everybody to give this a try right now, we also have I've created a Google sheet to collect some feedback and to get you to answer some questions specifically around a case study that we've got lined up. And so I'd like to give that a go right now to get everybody to pull that up. If on the top right of your screen, you should have the GoToWebinar sort of platform or launchpad, whatever you want to call it, or dashboard. And one of the options, there's a chat box. And if you open that, or look at that, there's the first comment that I made at 11:14 this morning is a link to a document. So if everyone who's participating right now, if you could click that, and that should bring you to a Google document. And if you're not able to do so, it's not the end of the world at all. It's not critical. It's helpful if a couple of participants can pull that up, but I'm going to get everybody to do that now. So again, in the chat box, just click on that link. And again, it's not the end of the world. And somebody's asking me to repost, so I will do that. And actually so I'll just pull out and do that. Hold on just a moment. There we go. So I just put the link there again. And I'll refer to that again and give us a second to pull that up when I get to that section of the webinar this morning. All right, we're off. So Vantage Point, quick background on us. This is our mission: to convene, connect, and equip not-for-profit leaders through interactive learning. We run workshops out of our location in downtown Vancouver on Melville Street. We also do custom workshops off-site where we visit organizations around the province to deliver workshops on a range of topics focused on lifting organizational capacity in the not-for-profit sector. And we also do sessions like this, webinars. My role here at Vantage Point is as consulting manager, so we also engage with organizations on a one-on-one basis to walk them through strategic planning process, board development review, succession plans, or HR plans. So that's sort of the range of activities that we engage in here at Vantage Point. Again, this webinar is brought to you through by us together in a partnership with Gymnastics BC. Here are the items we're going to review today. So the focus, again, board fundamentals, roles, and responsibilities. Heavy emphasis on the role of the board. And the latter end of the webinar is all around how the board functions. And so I'm going to really ask everybody to put their critical caps on and give a lot of consideration to how your board functions, how you work together as a team, how you work together with the senior staff and the senior coaches in your respective clubs. And also we're going to start by considering, what's the role of the board overall, but at the end, that's where we're going, is how well your board functions. Specifically, these are the items we're going to look at: roles and responsibilities of board members. Here at Vantage Point, we have a specific outline of 8 ways the board takes care of the organization. And so that is to say, in fulfilling their role in oversight, which is really important and one of the primary roles of a board of directors, the oversight of the organization. We've outlined 8 ways the board can sort of ensure they're doing that. We rely heavily on a framework referred to as governance as leadership, and this is this third point here. And so we're going to review and explore what that looks like. And specifically, we have a bit of a case study to explore what there are 3 sort of frames of reference or perspectives that are outlined in that governance as leadership approach, and we're going to explore that. And then I mentioned talking about how the board functions, and literally how the board functions as a team. And that's what these latter 2 points are all about. Talking about what happens at your board meetings, how engaging they are, how functional they are, and then the oxygen mask. So how well, and that's sort of the analogy there is, on an airplane. And before putting on the oxygen mask for those around you who may need assistance, putting on your own oxygen mask first. And so the board, an emphasis on the board to do that, to not always focus on taking care of the organization, but to pay attention to and focus once in a while on supporting and improving their own functionality, health, and capacity. So here's the first poll we've got. This is to give me a sense of who we've got here today. I'm going to pull up a poll, and if you could answer your question to this. This is around you and your role in the organizations that you're coming from today. So you should be able to see this poll right now. If you want to pop in your response, I'll leave this up for about 20 seconds. Then we'll look at the results to give me a bit of background on everyone who's joining us for this webinar this morning. Okay, a couple new, most seasoned so far. I will post these results so you can all see them. And a couple have served, so we'll give this 5 more seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll. Okay, so here are the results. So most of you are seasoned board members, and you're currently or have served on multiple boards. A quarter folks on the webinar today have served on a board before, but maybe are not currently, and then a couple who are new to their role in the board members. So that's great context and background for myself. Appreciate that very much. We'll hide this and keep rolling forward. This approach in preparing for this workshop, and I have to say too, coming from the gymnastics world myself, having been in a senior role at a gymnastics club and also served on the in a board capacity. This approach at Vantage Point is pretty unique. It's pretty advanced and exciting. If I could make that statement, I'm obviously quite biased, but I'm quite excited at this framework, and so I'm excited to get feedback from everyone what they think of this this model. So if I could get you right now, so you make sure you've got some concrete takeaways from the session, if you could pull out a piece of paper and at the top of the piece of paper write down these three things: blooms, thorns, and buds. The idea here is that while the webinar is underway, you can immediately make notes when you come across something that, gosh, you're doing right now and you're doing it really, really well. And so this is to reinforce items that are currently in place in your organization, and an emphasis to continue doing those things to make sure they continue to take place. Thorns are something you come across in this webinar that you hear from me or see on a slide that is like, gosh, we could really, this either is not in place at all, or we really don't do this to its full extent, so we could really improve that. That'd be a thorn item, so that would be going into the thorn bucket. And then buds is something completely new that's not in place at all that maybe you want to try. So a brand new idea that you'd want to put in place going forward. This really provides an immediate takeaway after the webinar of items that you could follow up on, and primarily to emphasize the items that you're doing now to continue, and maybe possibly new items that you might want to consider in the future. Okay, so this first piece, to start at a high level, the role of the board overall in governing an organization, performing their main function in oversight over the organization, and specifically the responsibilities of board members. So I've got another poll here to prod your thinking along these lines. And this is to get a sense of whether your organization, whether you describe your gymnastics club and your role on the board as a working board or more of a governance board. So I've got the poll up. If you could have a look at these responses and click the one that most matches where you are at, that would be great. Okay, so I'll give this 10 more seconds and then I'll close. And so far the minority of responses are at the working board end of the spectrum and the exclusive governance board end of the spectrum, with a majority between those two extremes. Oh, still some responses coming in. I'll give this a couple more seconds. Tough question. It's hard to put yourself into a category. I understand and appreciate that. Okay, I'm gonna cut this off. So if you're reflecting, you've had your chance. Okay, let's have a look at this. So 17% working board, minority at the other end of the spectrum, exclusively governance-oriented or governance-focused boards. 42% working board the majority of the time, but making time now and then to do, or carving out the time necessary to pursue and consider governance-oriented issues. And then 33% sort of in second place, governance board, but get sidetracked by operational issues. And that's certainly my experience. If I had to think back, there was both at Prince George Gymnastics and at Delta Gymnastics, certainly governance oriented, but getting sidetracked. Sometimes, oftentimes, and other times of the year less so. So that's great feedback. And as the first, it's important to consider that, because this slide keeps jumping out of here. Okay, there we go. The primary function of a board, and this is difficult to do in any organization, whether it's in sport or gymnastics or any other sector that we work with here at Vantage Point. One of the primary, most important results, and I've just realized I didn't hide this poll result, so you're still looking at that. There we go. So you should all see this governance slide. Apologies for that. So one of the most important roles of the board is this governance function. And I challenge everyone, just write down on a piece of paper, when I say the word governance, what comes to mind? And so don't share that with me in the chat box or anything. Just consider it for yourself for a second. Saying the word governance, there's these two words up on this slide. But for you, what does that really mean? We throw this term around and sometimes without really understanding what it's all about. The word is derived from a Greek word meaning to steer. Okay, so we're thinking of steering a ship. In current discourse, it means more specifically to steer or guide from a position of authority. So the emphasis, the board are the ones in a position of authority, and your role there is to steer the organization. If you're to consider a ship, it's very important, obviously, that there's folks scrubbing the decks of the ship, manning the sails, cooking food, cleaning everything, but it's also important that there's somebody back in the map room mapping out where the ship is going and how they're going to get there. And that's the role of the board, to set those milestones, those guideposts, where they're going, and to map out literally how they're going to get there. So the emphasis on this slide, future focused and external, this is one of the most important roles for the board. Now, that being said, and appreciating, and my experience certainly at the board level, getting sidetracked by operational issues, that is inevitable. And so never feel guilty about that. It's more important for us to own that and to have explicit conversations around, okay, how can we still do our operations piece that is likely inevitable and also get into the governance sphere. But you've got to remember that if a board is a working board at one extreme, so and this is more the case for very small organizations that don't have a lot of paid staff, or startup organizations where the board is in place and they're largely the same folks who are governing the organization are the same folks who are doing everything and carrying out the activities of the organization. Even for organizations in that state, they need to carve out the time to do the governance, to do the future-looking stuff, to be setting those guideposts, to consider, if we continue doing all these activities we're doing, where does that bring us in 3 years, in 4 years, in 5 years? And so this slide is meant to outline 3 important functions for any organization. Now, what everybody listening here today should not do, you should not take these 3 things and restructure your organization along these lines. This is not meant to be an organizational structure. This is just emphasizing 3 important functions that need to be carried out in a robust organization: operational activities, managerial activities, and governance. The emphasis here is that, if the board is not doing their governance role, if they're so locked into operations, there is literally no one doing the governance piece. They're the only body that's got the authority or the capacity to raise governance questions, to answer those questions, to research governance questions are the board. And if you're not doing it, then nobody is. And this is a challenge when you're getting sidetracked or pulled into operational discussions. And so one conversation that needs to occur for your board is, okay, given that we do, or if we do get caught up in and have to consider operational issues, and in the gymnastics world, sometimes these can be technical discussions, right? If clubs at an early stage where a head coach is the most senior staff person and they're talking about what rules they're going to, which code of points they're going to follow, whether it's the BC code, the Alberta code, or use the American system, or which set of rules or which criteria to accept children into the competitive program. I mean, those are operational questions, right? Those are technical questions. And it may very well be the case that a club, does need to discuss those items for a certain time at the board level. Ideally, though, that's not the case. Ideally, at some point, that will be volunteers performing their role as volunteer coaches or the coaches themselves. And ideally, the board can start to carve out time for those bigger governance questions. So it's important to think, okay, overall, who's doing these 3 things in an organization? In the gymnastics setting, a transition that many clubs go through, they're heavily operationally focused with coaches who have considerable technical expertise, where sometimes clubs get caught up, they don't have a lot of expertise or focuses on the managerial dimension. And so this is considering, yes, we've got a head coach, maybe the head coach reports directly to the board. However, does the head coach have the time and the expertise to manage the organization as a whole? If not, do we need a separate role? Do we need somebody else to do more of the management of the organization? A second question to raise there is, how does that person then get along with the head coaches? And then in that context, who reports to the board? So who is going to straddle the line between governance and management? Is it the head coach, or is it a club administrator together with a head coach, or is it just a director of operations or a club administrator? So very tough questions that I leave you to consider and stay up all night thinking about. Okay, which hat? So this is in reference to that previous slide that outlines those three roles: governance, management, and operational roles. In a working board scenario, I mentioned that you might have board members who are very much involved in carrying out the operations of an organization. Well, organizations in that boat, or individuals, pardon me, find themselves in that situation, you need to ask yourself in any event or any activity or any engagement, which hat are you wearing? Are you there as a board member? Are you wearing your board hat? Or are you volunteering at an event for your club, and so you're no longer acting as a board member, you're there to support or act as a support staff or in a support function for a specific event. So the example of this for gymnastics would be, somebody who sits on the board coming and volunteering at a fundraising event or volunteering at the club's annual competition. And it's important that board members know that when they come and volunteer at a competition, they're not to act like a board member. They're not to carry out and carry themselves from a position of authority as a board member. They are accountable to whoever's in charge of the event, whoever, whatever activity at the competition they've been placed to work under. They are accountable to that person. You don't have individual authority to act as a board member. The board as a whole, as a collective unit, has authority over the overall governance of a club. But if board members are also volunteering at specific events, that is a separate function. And board members need to literally, wear a different hat in those roles and not act like board members. And so that's the first important distinction when we speak about board governance, is to clarify which hat the board members are wearing and at what times. Likewise, when board members are sitting at board meetings, they need to take off that volunteer hat and take on, the interest and the consideration for the club as a whole. This is can be a huge challenge for parents of competitive athletes, to be completely honest. They may have the interests of one particular program top of mind sitting in board meetings. However, in board meetings, your role is a governance role. So the oversight role and the emphasis there is on the governance and the direction for the organization as a whole, not for the competitive program, not for the recreational program, not for any program in particular. It's for the organization as a whole. And so board members also need to put that hat on when they're sitting at the board table, which can be difficult to do as a parent sitting at the board meeting, especially if your program is up for discussion. Okay, this next framework is another look at some organizational functions. And it's it's meant to distinguish further what areas are within the realm of the board and what areas are in the realm of the staff or management. The board has final decision-making power and decision-making authority over these top items: the vision of the organization, what the organization does in pursuit of the mission, success, and overall goals or priorities. The board has final decision-making power over those items. Management, so head coach, club administrators, senior staff, they are given final decision-making power over strategies, activities, and performance objectives. Now you'll note the words I used there. I said final decision-making power. So this graph in no way means that the head coach, the club administrator, or the senior staff of the club will not be involved in setting priorities or goals. Okay, it is very much the case, especially for clubs in a startup stage or that rely heavily on the direction of the head coach or the head coach of the women's and men's program or the rec program. Those individuals, those senior staff, will very much and should very much have a huge influence over the mission of the organization, what defines success for your club is, and what goals your club is working towards. However, the board has the final say. Okay, so the board, those senior staff, at the end of the day, they are not accountable to the members of the club for these things. The board is. You are on the board. And so whatever the head coach comes back with for his or her goals for the year, or the defined success or mission, it's up to the board to approve those things and to give the final ratification of yes or no. Because if there's questions around those from the members, those go to the board, and the board is accountable for those. So they can be heavily influenced by other, the management, but the board has that final decision-making power. Likewise, board may be very heavily involved in discussing specific activities. This graph doesn't mean the board never talks about anything the club actually does. They absolutely will. And in fact, talking about goals without talking about actual things the club is actually doing is a pretty difficult exercise. It's pretty difficult to do that in a pure form. So at board meetings, absolutely, you'll talk about operational matters, but what it's important for the board to do are to extract themselves from those items and consider and ask themselves, okay, given all that we know about what the club is doing in the next year, 6 months, the specific activities that have been outlined, where is this bringing us? Is this aligned with our mission? Does this align with our values? Does this reflect who we are as a club, as an organization? I've got a case study shortly that's going to really drive this point home around a situation a club could be potentially faced with that would, the questions the case study raises are exactly along these lines. So what does this mean for our values? What does this mean for the mission of our organization? But they will do so in relation to the activities. And board members may very much, be involved in discussing those items, but the final say over specifically which activities are going to be undertaken rests with management or senior staff. Okay, so the emphasis on this side, final decision-making power, does not mean board doesn't talk about the stuff at the bottom, and does not mean management does not talk about the stuff at the top. It just is meant to distinguish who has the final decision over those items. Okay, this next piece, this is where it gets really tangible for yourselves, board members. 8 ways the board takes care of the organization. So the BC Society Act outlines very specific legal and fiduciary duties for the board of directors. Best practices in board governance, there's a whole range of activities that are emphasized that it's important for the board to do. Over a bunch of years at Vantage Point, we've distilled these down to kind of 8 basic ones in fulfilling those responsibilities to take care of the organization. All right. So I'm going to go through these a little bit specifically. The first one we've already talked about. What does the organization do? So clarifying what's the mission of the organization and the vision. Why do you exist in the first place? So the mission, to get specific, this is when somebody unfamiliar with the organization asks, oh, you're on the board of XYZ club in Vancouver, what do you guys do? Your response to that should be something that's pretty close to the mission. We never say at Vantage Point that board members and staff and volunteers should be able to recount the exact mission of an organization verbatim, but when they get asked, what does that organization do? Their answer to that question should be pretty close to whatever you've written down as your mission. All right. Now, the board's role is not only in confirming what those things are, what the vision and mission of the organization are, but in making sure everybody in the organization knows what they are. Okay, it's the board's role to roll those out, to communicate those, to ask the head coach, do all of the other coaches in the organization, do they know why we exist? Do they know what we're here to do? Do they know what we focused on for the next 3 years, for the next 4 years, for the next 5 years? Does everybody know our goal is to put athletes on a national team? Or no, does everybody, if you were to ask 10 different people in the organization why they thought the organization was there, will they have 10 different answers? It's the board role to ensure alignment around that. Okay, so not only setting out the mission and vision, making sure that those things are communicated across the organization. Secondly, and this is a big one and a challenging one for many clubs, selecting and supporting. Now here it says executive director. This is simply the most senior staff person in an organization, the person that reports to the board of directors. We work with organizations where this role is called general manager. It could be artistic director with arts groups that we work with. It may be head coach. This could be club coordinator, club administrator, director of operations. It's not dependent on this title. The important piece is the most senior staff person who reports to the board of directors. Some organizations have 2 people that report to the board of directors. In arts organizations, it's a general manager and an artistic director. In gymnastics clubs, maybe you have a club administrator and a head coach, or maybe there are multiple head coaches for multiple programs that report to the board of directors. That can get messy, and I'm not going to go into detail around that today. It's not something to completely avoid, but something that, if that's the situation you're in, to just know and to pursue a high degree of clarity around each person's role, what their terms of reference are, and what they're meant to report and discuss at the board member, and how they relate to the board. Okay. Specifically here, though, selecting and supporting that senior person. So again, if there's questions from the membership around the leadership of the organization, that rests with the board. It is up to the boards to approve of who fills that role and to support that person in filling out their role. And this one I know is challenging and does not always take the place in many of the organizations we work with across all sectors, but also in sport groups and gymnastics clubs, reviewing his or her performance. Is there a consistent evaluation structure in place to review the performance of the head coach or the executive director? Is there a process to set goals for that person, to collaboratively set goals for that person for the coming year, for a 6-month or annual time frame? And then whose task is it to review those items? Okay, those are all board functions that need to take place. Fiscal management. So this is typically the low-hanging fruit amongst board members in any organization. The quickest go-to, what do you do as a board member? Oh, we review the financials. That's oftentimes the first thing that comes to mind when you think of your role on the board, is ensuring the fiscal management and familiarity and reviewing the finances of an organization. But this can also include questions, so knowing the budget, making sure that expenses and revenues that occur on an actual basis align with the line items that are outlined in the budget, but also when the budget is being created, to play a role in that, to take a role in creating the annual budget for an organization, and to ask tough questions. Not is this going to break our budget, do we have enough money for this, but also going further than that and asking, if we spend money on this, what are we not spending money on? What's the opportunity cost of spending money in one area versus another? What are we missing out on? In the gymnastics world, it's no secret that competitive programs don't make money on their own. They tend not to, on their own exclusively make a lot of money. Does the board understand that breakdown? Do they understand that the costs of competitive programs are offset by recreational programs or grants or fundraising? Do they know what that breakdown is? Do they have a hand in influencing what that is or setting goals around that? My experience is that no, they usually don't. That's usually set out by the the club administrator and head coach, which is fine. But the board should be aware of those items. Strategic planning. So not only mission and vision, but the specific goals the organization is going to work towards. In the previous slide outlining the organizational functions, these are referred to as priorities. And so in a sort of a medium-term time frame, 2, 3, or 4 years at most, what are 3, 4, or 5 very specific goals the organization is going to work towards? And then how are they going to get there? So what's the best use of everybody's time and effort? Is it the best use of everyone's time to run 5 competitions every year, or to participate in, to do 6 fundraisers plus 2 bottle drives? Is that really the most strategic approach to getting you towards your objectives? Maybe there's other ways the club could move towards their goals. Those are the really exciting discussions at a board level. Approving and monitoring programs and services. So again, this ideally management are making the final say of what programs the club offers, but boards should know what they are, and there should be some kind of process in place for senior staff to report to the board how it's going. So, literally taking each of the programs and outlining, these 2 programs are doing really well, this one not so much, and here are the reasons, and here are the thoughts that we're having for next year, and for the board to approve those overall directions and have some kind of mechanism to monitor how well they're doing. So you'll notice in that point number 5, the emphasis there would be on the words approve and monitor as opposed to create, right? Resource development. This is a fancy way of saying fundraising, which is relatively new for a lot of organizations to consider as a board role, is a pretty new role in the context of gymnastics clubs specifically, sport overall for sure, but also gymnastics clubs specifically. So resource development, this is speaking specifically to financial resources or fund development. Now, this can mean a whole bunch of things, but what it does not necessarily mean is going around asking for money. This might be as simple as all the board members know what the fundraising targets are for the year, and wherever they are, when they're at networking events, in their role at work, wherever else they happen to be volunteering in their other voluntary capacities, they're telling all their friends and colleagues, firstly, that they are on the board of XYZ Gymnastics Club, and secondly, that the club has these goals for the year and has this program that's coming up with a fundraising goal, and you're interested? Well, let me put you in touch with the head coach and they can give you more information. So this can include roles such as, this can be as simple, I guess, as connecting the organization with others in the community. It doesn't have to mean knocking on doors, literally asking for money. Just making connections. For instance, is it on your LinkedIn profile that you're on the board of XYZ Club? Do you introduce yourself at networking functions as a board member of XYZ Gymnastics Club? In an ideal world for us, board members, that's the first point of introduction, is to say, yeah, my name is Joe Smith, I'm on this board. I also happen to be a lawyer, but putting that first, and sharing that as a way to spark interest, to make connections between the organization and the external world. Again, if the board isn't doing that, if the board isn't forging relationships, isn't raising the profile of the organization with their networks and leveraging their networks, and again, not to necessarily ask for money, but just for the sake of awareness, there's not really anybody else, especially in the gymnastics world, doing that. Nobody really knows about gymnastics, guys, beyond yourselves. If individuals in BC, they don't have their kids signed up in gymnastics, don't attend competitions, they barely know what gymnastics is. And there's not many people within gymnastics clubs that have the time or the resources or the ability to get the word out. One of the biggest underutilized assets of a club to get the word out is the board of directors. And so own that role. And that's one way you can look at resource development. Doesn't necessarily mean asking for money. Sound risk management. And so this is just knowing, what insurance the club has in place, what policies they have to mitigate risk. Any organization, doesn't have to be sport, doesn't have to be gymnastics. There are risks involved in carrying out activities of any kind, and so the board needs to know of what policies are in place, any insurance that might be appropriate or relevant, and how the society might be exposed. So a reasonable understanding of the exposure that the society is facing by carrying out their activities, and what policies are in place to protect against that. That's the board role, to review that stuff. This 8th one is related to point number 6, the resource development, enhancing the organization's public image. Again, we get caught up in our silos in the not-for-profit sector, and especially in sport clubs. A huge advantage of the board's role is, you're not full-time staff with the organization. You have other connections. You have connections beyond the gymnastics community. And it's not necessarily the case you have to use those connections to, invite people to competitions or to get them to, buy chocolates every year. But do they know, are they excited about the organization? Do they know what the organization is doing? Do you use every opportunity when you're connecting with colleagues to raise the profile of the activities the organization might be engaged in? Are you telling your friends and colleagues? Again, not a lot of capacity in gymnastics clubs to do that last thing, and that's really an opportunity for the board to dive in. Okay, so now I'm gonna pause for a moment. I see there have been a couple of questions, and I'm hopeful that they've been technical, and my colleague has been able to pull them up. I'll just pull these up. Okay, and they're all technical, so we're all good there. I'm going to get everybody now to pull up that chat. If you could pull up the chat box and go to webinar and click on this link to this Google document. So I'm going to pull this up myself. So you should see something like this. So this first question, I just went through 8 roles for the board of directors. And this is great. I see some of you are pulling up this sheet. I would like you to write down on this sheet, and keep in mind you're sharing this with everybody, so it's up to you how much specifics you put on here, all right? So keep in mind this is public. This is absolutely public. Which of these 8 roles that I just went through, which are the 3 that your board is doing best? Which top 3, which would be the top 3 roles at your gymnastics club? Which of those, considering those 8 roles, which of the top 3 that your club is putting in place? So just start typing. You should be able to type right into this document. If you could put those in, and we'll share what everybody thinks around that. So the first response, and this definitely aligns with my experience, fiscal management. And I see 2 people almost typed over each other. Another, fiscal management. And yet someone started putting below that which you could do better. So yeah, go ahead and do that as well if you'd like. So the first question, which of the 8 roles is your board doing best? And then the next question, out of those 8, which could you do a better job of? So lots of fiscal management. Somebody's saying mission and vision. That's terrific. So for the person putting, we do not have an executive director, I would add, so who is it that reports to the board? And it'd be that person that we're thinking of. So, whichever coach or senior staff person that sits on the board level, thinking of that person. So they've added some further clarification for staff members to report to the board. So that's very much acting as a committee of the whole. And no, that's fine. If that's working for you, that's terrific. That can get a little bit muddy, so a word of caution. But if it's working for in that scenario, absolutely terrific. So I would challenge you in that case, considering the role of the board would be to set goals for all 4 of those staff members. And so maybe there's a personnel committee. There should be some. It's meant that there really has to be some connection between the board and the performance of senior staff. And the primary mechanism of that is for the boards to select and support one singular staff member who then subsequently hires the rest of the staff. If you're in a case where, in this case, 4 staff members that report to the board, then that connection, the board needs to own that responsibility and be accountable for the performance of all 4 of those staff members. And to do so, needs to be involved in a process to set goals and to evaluate their performance. That can be very informal, or it could be a bit more formal, but that's terrific if that's happening. So thank you for everyone. This is terrific. So again, just to review these a little bit, really heavy on the as a top role that's not a big concern or coming across as something that's done really well, the fiscal management piece, so that's terrific. We also have your mission and vision, hiring the senior staff member, that's terrific, and then monitoring programs and services. That's really encouraging, especially in gymnastics clubs, because clubs can get caught up into situations where the board has very little awareness or understanding of the programs that a club is operating. Those are, entrusted to the senior staff, which is as it should be, but the board does need some kind of awareness. They do need to be aware. There shouldn't, if something goes wrong in a program or the club gets into a risky situation or there are complaints, those shouldn't necessarily be a complete surprise to the board, or the programs that are being described or that come up shouldn't be a surprise to the board. You should know what those are. As roles that could possibly do better, so I've got the first one, public image, strategic planning, and resource development. And that also aligns with my own experience in the gymnastics world. Certainly the resource development one, it can be a huge challenge asking parents of competitive athletes to become really active in fundraising. And so again, the emphasis there, maybe just making sure the board is aware of fundraising targets and encouraging them to communicate that they are on the board of your organization and to spread the word, sort of thing. Again, the resource development public image piece could be very much combined. So big thank you for providing that feedback. Turn back to our slides though. So those of you who are there in that document, you can exit out of there. We're going to keep going through our slideshow. My colleague is reminding me, I've muffled myself with my hand. Apologies if you couldn't hear me there for a second. Okay, so those are 8 roles of the board. And again, I just want to emphasize, I mean, if you read through the BC Society Act, it's a lot of legalese outlining the role of the board and carrying out their oversight role. And there's a whole bunch of best practices out there that can be pretty heady stuff. If you just, as a board, focus on, okay, are we doing these 8 things? And how well are we doing these 8 things? That goes a long way to fulfilling your responsibility in overseeing the operations of a society, in governing a society, if you can do those 8 things. All right, so that's a phenomenal, very powerful checklist that's not legalese, that's very, very specific. And for how those things get carried out in every board of directors in every society will look different. The important piece is, is the board aware that those are what their roles are. I would add for the moment, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, are those 8 rules referred to somehow in the board manual, in the board, if you have the board members sign a letter of agreement of some kind, or the basic job description of board members, is there reference? This is an opportunity to review those items. Is there some kind of reference in some way to each of those 8 items? Okay, this slide is another outline of what that oversight role can look like. It can look across these 4 dimensions. So there's a financial sort of dimension, an operational dimension, a legal dimension, and a people dimension. I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering all of these. To define the operational one a little bit, again, the emphasis here is on approving and monitoring, not on creating the programs or services that a club is operating, but to be aware of what the programs are and to have some mechanism in place to monitor and understand the success, the relative success or failure or challenges in the respective programs. We've already talked about the financial piece, and it's sounding like that's a pretty strong element of board members and participants today. The legal dimension I wanted to spend a moment on. You can consider this in these ways, and I'd ask everybody to maybe write this down because this is another important takeaway. And so put it under either your bloom, thorn, or your bud category, depending on where you sit. Legal can be considered duty of loyalty, duty of care to the organization, and fiduciary duty. All right, and fiduciary is a fancy word that's emphasized in the BC Society Act. Fiduciary simply means you are liable and responsible for things you do not own. So you're responsible for things that belong to somebody else. Okay? And the distinction there, the emphasis and the reason for that fancy term is because as a board director of a society, you are completely liable and completely responsible for all the assets and the activities of that organization. However, you have 0 ownership of anything in that organization. And it's an important distinction because despite the fact that no board members own anything in a society does not mean they can absolve themselves of legal liability. That is not the case. That's what's meant by the term fiduciary duty, okay, is you're liable and responsible even though you don't own it, even though you do not have a direct vested interest. That's all that fiduciary means. All right, so if you see that term crop up, that's what that means, and it's also important to emphasize that liability does rest with the board, and for that reason, through Gymnastics B through Sport BC, that you do have insurance as a board member of a society. All right, but I also mentioned duty of care and duty of loyalty, and I wanted to bring up the duty of loyalty. As a board member, you need to be able to demonstrate, and through your your engagement on the board, how you act as a board member in board meetings and beyond, you need to be able to demonstrate loyalty to the organization. And your loyalty to the organization needs to come first. It needs to come before other interests you may have, other passions you may have. And so the simple explanation, way to outline this, a tangible example, if you own a t-shirt company that makes and sells t-shirts and you're on the board, and you suggest to the board, hey, we should buy our t-shirts from this company in which I'm an owner. First of all, that's a conflict of interest. Second of all, that raises a question around where does your loyalty lie? Are you loyal to the organization or are you loyal to the t-shirt company? Now, another example of this that is a bit more contentious, potentially in the gymnastics world, as a parent, where does your loyalty lie? If push comes to shove, and there's a tough decision facing the organization, and specifically, I would say, facing the program in which your child is enrolled, where's your loyalty going to lie? I'm a parent, and I know where my loyalty will lie, and it would not necessarily be with the program in which my children are enrolled all of the time. Now, that's fine. Do not go away from this meeting, this webinar, and resign from the board. That's not what I'm saying at all. But you need to be aware of that, okay? And in your board role, you need to be able to 100% of the time act in the interest of the society first. If it ever comes up that something is being discussed that is too close to home, maybe it's your child's program, maybe it's something that is going to place that loyalty, that hierarchy out of balance, that you're going to have to, because you're a parent or whatever, you're going to have to put your loyalty elsewhere first. In other words, to your children first. You'll need to consider, okay, do I need to remove myself from this conversation? And then a subsequent consideration is, do I need, has it gotten to a point where I need to remove myself from the board? Because as a board, you need to support the overall direction of the society. You need to have loyalty to the society and the overall operations. You need to support the senior staff and what they're doing in support of that senior role. And if you're not able to do that, if you can't exhibit loyalty to that, you need to start asking some tough questions around your involvement on the board. And as parents, that can be a very difficult place to be. Okay, to get a bit more specific, and I don't want to belabor this, in the context of gymnastics clubs, where this becomes a real challenge is in the gym gossip. So you're sitting on the board and you're sitting then on the bleachers watching your children at a practice. So and so comes over and asks you, hey, so I heard about this decision the board made. I totally disagree with it. Aren't you on the board? What do you think about this? That will be a very tough place to be if you're sitting on the board. As a board member, even if you're not sitting in a board meeting, if you're sitting as a parent in the bleachers, you need to exhibit loyalty to the organization first. And you need to support whatever decision the board came up with or landed on, even if you did not in the board meeting support that decision. Okay, so there's notions of solidarity that tie in here. In a board meeting, it is fully appropriate to disagree with and to raise tough issues when important items are being discussed. Once a decision has been made, even if you disagreed with it, in carrying out your duty of loyalty, you need to support that decision, even if you disagreed with it. And that can be tough if you're in the bleachers, faced with tough questions from other parents who might be your friends. So that can be kind of an important one and a tough one. And the duty of care is simply saying you'll perform, the board will perform their due diligence in carrying out and performing their role in overseeing the organization. Okay, the people one, just to touch on this briefly, are there sufficient resources in place, the right people in place to do the job? So I mentioned this previously in the context of that slide that outlined those three functions: governance, management, and operations. So asking the question, okay, who is carrying out these three things? Is it the board that's doing all three? Does the head coach perform both a managerial role and an operational role? Given the size of our club, is that still appropriate? Have we grown to a point where we need to consider other managerial staff, or carving out some of the head coach's time? Should we start asking that head coach to spend less time coaching and more time doing the managerial tasks for the organization? Or do we need to do what some clubs have done and recruit somebody explicitly from a business or managerial background to take that role of executive director, who maybe has no experience in gymnastics, but knowing that that person will not be involved in carrying out the operations of the club, maybe they don't need that. So that's what's meant by the sort of the people dimension to this one. All right, so that is an outline, 8 very specific roles to take away and consider. Is our board doing this? Are these reflected in our board role descriptions when we sign on as board members? And then four dimensions to consider that oversight role. All right. Now at Vantage Point, we refer to this framework called governance as leadership, and this is actually it's the title of a book. And I've got the last slide of this presentation refers to the book if anybody wants to follow up, so I do have that. Governance as leadership is, for any of you and I say this because a number of you indicated you have extensive board experience as a board member on boards of directors or serve on multiple boards. If any of you are familiar with the Carver model or pure governance approach, governance as leadership could be kind of considered Carver 2.0. Okay, so it's kind of taking that initial suggestion by Carver that boards need to extract themselves from operations and spend more time considering overall policy and direction and governance questions. This is taking that to the next level and making it a bit more specific. So we're going to explore that now. So at the bottom of this slide, here's the title of the book. It's these 3 authors, and the full reference is provided at the end of this presentation. These are 3 lenses that are outlined in this framework. Okay, so this, when you think governance as leadership, it's these 3 things. And this is to say that when the board is faced with any question or any decision or is discussing any items, there are 3 perspectives or 3 lenses that can be applied in considering that question: fiduciary, strategic, and generative. And I'm going to go through these specifically, and then we're going to do a case study to explore what each of these looks like. The emphasis, one of the primary things I want to emphasize here is this framework is meant to convey the notion that no single lens on its own is wrong, inappropriate, and in fact, great decisions include all three of these perspectives to some extent. And none of the three are less legitimate or inauthentic than the other three. Where these guys are coming at this, Chait, Ryan, and Taylor, at the outset of their book, the Carver model and the governance, the pure approach to governance, there was a heavy emphasis on the fiduciary perspective that's outlined here. So overseeing the operations of an organization, making sure the risk management policy is in place, making sure the expenses of the organization don't exceed the budget for those items, basic legal compliance, regulatory compliance, and fiscal accountability. That's what's meant by the fiduciary category. But they add to this, they say that's not enough. In serving on a board of directors in a very robust capacity, these other lenses need to be added to that perspective, the strategic considerations and generative considerations. So strategic, how are we getting to where we're going? If we continue down this road, where does that lead us? Where are we going to be in 5 years if we keep carrying out these activities? If we continue this set of fundraising activities, where does that get us? And then the generative question, why are we here in the first place? These are the really big questions. How are we structured? What are we here to pursue? Why were we founded, 20, 30, 40 years ago? Are those same reasons the same reasons today? Or are we here for a different reason today than we were when we were founded? So let's look at these in a bit more detail. So the fiduciary one first. So I mentioned this is basic oversight. Again, basic legal compliance, regulatory compliance, and fiscal accountability. However, I'd challenge everybody here to consider it's not only making sure, okay, going through the financials every month, are there any exceptions to the budget, anything exceeding the line item that we budgeted for the year? It's more than that. When you're doing the budgeting, do you know what the budgeting process is? Does the board get involved in setting the budget for the year? Does the board ask tough questions like, if we spend money here, what are we missing out on? What are we not spending? Where might we spend our money, or how can we spend our money differently to get at the same way? Is there a different way of approaching this? So fiduciary can be considered taking oversight, but taking it to the next level. Now this again, this is the first sort of immediate go-to when you ask somebody, what's your role as a board member? It's usually some answer that falls under this perspective. It's usually something that aligns with the fiduciary perspective. All right, so some more specific questions here. Can we afford it? What are we missing out? Is the budget balanced? Legal, ethical dimensions, and then that monitoring role. So some mechanism to monitor the programs so the board is aware of the relative success of different programs. Okay, strategic. So again, Carver 2.0, where are we going? What are the guideposts? Thinking of that definition of governance as steering or guiding from a position of authority. This is where that really becomes real in the strategic lens or perspective from this framework. 2 years from now, where do we want to be? Given that, how are we going to get there? How are we getting there right now? Looking at all the activities a club is doing, all the different programs, the recreational program, the competitive program, the number of competitions you have every year. If you continue to do that, where does that bring you in 2 or 3 years? Again, no one is usually doing that. If the board's not asking those questions, don't assume somebody else is. Chances are nobody is. And so it's important for the board to step aside and start asking those questions. Examples that a lot of clubs have faced that have been brought forward by senior staff. You know what? Demand for our programs has totally outstripped our capacity to do them. We need more space. We need a bigger building. We need a standalone building. It's not enough to be setting up equipment in a school gym anymore. We need a permanent facility where we don't have to set up and take down equipment anymore. Okay, given that as a goal, how are we going to get there? Are we going to remain as a nonprofit? Do we want to become change things, become a private enterprise? Do we want to, if we're going to need to do fundraising, if we're going to do a standalone facility, is it going to be in collaboration with the city, the municipal government? Do we want to market it or communicate it as some kind of provincial effort, as a provincial, as part of a provincial sport strategy? Are we going to call Brian at Gymnastics BC? Sorry, Brian, I know you're on this call, and ask him for a bunch of money. So, how are we going to do that, given that there's some goal in mind? Again, nobody's really doing that if the board is not. Other specific questions? Core competency. What are we really good at? Given what we're good at, how could we go about fundraising for a new facility or pursuing a new facility? Again, relating that to what the club is good at. Don't try to set yourselves up goals to engage in a whole bunch of relationship building if everybody on the board has zero time and consists exclusively of folks in the gymnastics community. Maybe as a first step, you need to recruit somebody on the board with ties in the business community, with ties in the private sector beyond the gymnastics club, with other maybe board members who are also board members of other sport groups, as a way to explore possible partnerships in building different facilities, right? These are all strategic questions. Also trends and factors. Okay, so we know an example of this, BC Gaming ended up not being an issue for sport clubs and youth-oriented programs, but could have been, very much could have been. It was very much, for about a month or two, a couple of years ago, was a big question whether BC Gaming money was still going to come through for a gymnastics club. So being aware of that and considering, okay, when this, if this, worst case scenario, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? Generative. So this is the most ambiguous but exciting lens. So why do we exist in the first place? What do we value? A big one for gymnastics clubs, and I'm almost reticent to throw this out there because it may be something that's percolating below the surface but hasn't been explicitly asked. Are we here to put kids on national team, or are we here to make gymnastics programs as accessible as possible for as many people as possible? Knowing that with limited coaches, with limited coaching time, limited space, the ability of a club to do both those things is limited. You can, if you're doing one more than the other, your ability to do the other will be limited. If your exclusive focus, 95%, is to get kids on the national team, that has certain implications for the rec program. It's a simple fact of life. Asking those questions, why are we here? Where are we going to focus? What do we exist to do? These are generative questions, okay? And it's appropriate and important for the board to be asking those questions. Now, this may be very heavily influenced, especially I think back to the comment when you made that it's for specific staff members that report to the board. These conversations can be very much in collaboration with senior staff. They may be very heavily influenced by the head coach of the women's program, the head coach of the men's program. Consider, okay, what's most important for our club? Why do we exist in the first place? What values do you espouse in the gym? And how are those reflected in our clubs to the community overall? How are we going to support and communicate and raise the profile of those items when we're off networking at local business association meetings and stuff like that? And can we support that? And agreeing what those things are together as a team, and then for the board, supporting those items going forward. But then also pushing back from time to time and asking the head coaches, is the reason we are here, for which this club was set out, for which we started this program, is that still the case today? Is it still relevant? And then take the strategic dimension. Is the way we're doing that right now, the current suite of programs that this club has operating, the current breakdown of classes on each day of the week, is that still the best way to get at this thing, or do we need to change things? So another outline of specific questions along the generative dimension. How does this reflect the values and beliefs? How can we reframe this? You can also think of this as, asking, it sounds ridiculous, but it's very true, deciding what to decide. So oftentimes boards will be presented questions that have already been very framed. So BC Gaming has been cut, we need to fundraise. That could be reframed to suggest that, BC Gaming probably can't count on it from year to year. Let's look at our overall funding mix. What's an overall business development strategy overall? Maybe we don't need to fundraise. Maybe there's a different way to get at this. Maybe we want to do more birthdays or something. Maybe we want to look at our business model to reframe this. Okay, so these could be considered under the generative bucket. Okay, we're going to launch into a case study now to get you exploring with these three mindsets. And before I do, I want to explain these a little bit further, where we found most value in using this framework, this governance as leadership framework, and these three lenses, fiduciary, strategic, and generative, is in reminding board members that each of us personally, we are all more prone to adopt one of those perspectives than the others most of the time. So you can just, and you know, most people I present this with can imagine somebody at the board meeting who's always got the crazy blue sky ideas, pie in the sky ideas. You know, they're the generative thinkers. They approach every question from a generative mindset. Oh, we've got this problem. Well, let's build a new building, or let's just partner with these guys and double our effort. Let's just hire, 25 new coaches. That's like, generative conversations. And some of us are a little bit more prone to have those conversations. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got some folks, usually it's the treasurer, who are saying, why are we even talking about this? We can't afford it. So this is a completely irrelevant conversation because we can't even afford to do this. This framework is a reminder that both those perspectives are appropriate. It's important to have somebody on the board who's the blue sky thinker, and it's also important to have someone who's really focused on the fiduciary dimension. What risk are we exposing ourselves to? Do we have the budget and the resources to do this? And then hopefully some board members that have the strategic mindset, that are thinking, is this path we're going down, is this really the best way to get at what we're trying to do? So all three of those perspectives are very important, and there should be a time at every board meeting to discuss those items. Okay, so here's a case study. So here's where you really need to engage, because you've got a task after I describe this situation. All right, so everyone, your utmost attention. You can all stop checking your email now. Pay very close attention. So a sports club, your gymnastics club, you've gotten a request to run a team building event for a prominent association of business leaders. So this could be a business improvement association, maybe it's the local chamber of commerce. So there's a prominent, local business association that's reached out to your club. They want to do a team building session. They're requesting the session for a very nominal fee, which would not cover, this would not cover the coaching costs and supervision costs of running the session. It's a lose money situation. In return, however, they're going to list your club as a community partner on their website, and they're suggesting that the session will raise the profile of your club in the local business community. And you know that many of the members of this business community, the Chamber of Commerce, are known to donate to local sport groups. So this is suggested as a way to raise the profile of your club in the local business community with individuals who may potentially donate to the club. However, this session itself will lose money. They requested the session during peak training hours when your club is the busiest, and so to do this, to pull this off, the competitive team's rotation schedule is going to have to be modified. So you're going to have to go to the head coach and tell him he's only on the beam for an hour and a half or something along those lines. So the question is, and it's gone to the board, should the club run the session? What I would like you to do are to write down what questions the board would ask, firstly from a fiduciary perspective. So put on a fiduciary cap. What are the fiduciary questions that need to be asked in this situation I've just outlined? Secondly, what are the strategic questions that need to be asked? And thirdly, what are the generative questions that need to be asked? Okay, so you're going to take a moment. Given the situation I've just described that has come to the board, what information does the board need from a fiduciary perspective, from a strategic perspective, and from a generative perspective? What questions are you going to bring up at the board meeting? And what questions do you need to have answered under each of those? Write those down for yourself, and then I'd like you to pull up the Google Sheet, the Google document again, please. And if you could write those in, that would be phenomenal. So on this Google document, I've got a section that refers to the case study, and you'll see I've got fiduciary questions, strategic questions, and generative questions. So again, business association, asking your club, we want to do team building. We only want to pay a tiny little bit of money for it, but we're going to list you as a supporter on our website, and a whole bunch of local businesses are now going to know about your club, who maybe didn't know about the club before. So what are the important questions to ask under each of these categories? Okay, so we've got one person filling out some great answers, but I know there's more of you on this webinar, so I'm going to challenge a bunch more of you to get on here and start putting in some answers to share those with the group. So given this case study I've just described, and even if you only put down some items under one of those categories, so what would the strategic questions be, what would the fiduciary questions be? Even just popping in a couple of questions that you would want to ask in this, given the situation I just described. I'll give this 3 more minutes and then we'll carry on. And by the way, I love the questions being popped in so far. They're great. I should say too, I do have some sample questions for each of these that I will go through as well. So we'll have a look at some of the items that I brought up under each of these categories previously. All right, 1 more minute. If anybody's got a stroke of brilliance, now's your chance. Enter your brilliant, thought-provoking questions from a fiduciary perspective, strategic perspective, or generative perspective. All right, thank you for that. Keep typing. Go ahead and keep typing, whoever is plugging away there. That's terrific. So fiduciary, how much is this going to cost in terms of lost training time and or rescheduling? Exactly, so opportunity cost. What are we missing out on? Inevitably, every organization, regardless of sector, size, or makeup, is engaged in trade-offs. There are things you're not doing because you're doing other things. Are those trade-offs conscious decisions? Or are those trade-offs by accident? Things that are not conscious decisions that you realize, oh gosh, by doing this one thing, we ended up not doing this other things. Ideally, the trade-offs in any organization are conscious trade-offs. They're explicitly recognized. Yeah, we're going to go down this road, and we acknowledge that, to use an example, by focusing on athletes on national team, there's going to be less time in the gym for recreational programs. We acknowledge that, we own that, and that's fine, right? To come to full ownership of those trade-offs. And those trade-offs align with this fiduciary perspective. Secondly, this person, somebody's put, what are the risks to consider with this endeavor? Absolutely. So what are liability issues, the risks that we're exposing ourselves to? Do, you know, each of the participants in the team building session, how is the insurance going to work? What safety protocols are we going to put in place? Okay, the strategic lens. So how many people involved? How much time? I would add here, I mean, so these are getting into logistical questions. These could belong as strategic. I would almost put these under the fiduciary dimension, right? So it's okay because they relate to sort of the success in the question and basic ethical and logistical ability of the club to pull it off. Strategic is more, how does this align, like how does this move this towards our goals? Is this aligned with where our club wants to be? Is this who we want to be? You know, do we have a major fundraising campaign that's going to launch in 6 months? If so, this is very, you know, something like this might be very well aligned. But if you know what, we've kind of decided we don't really need a lot of profile right now. We just finished a strategic campaign, and actually we just recruited Suzanne from the local community, who also sits on the Chamber of Commerce, to sit on the board. So maybe given that, maybe we don't need to have this team building event, right? And so asking, is this the right event for us right now, given what's going on in the organization? And then thirdly, who's making I love this question. Who's making the request, and do we want to be associated with them? Okay, do we share the same values? That's exactly a generative question, like who are we? Why are we here? And and when we're faced with a tough decision, like what does this say about us? Right? What does this say about our organization? This is an important question for sport groups. You know, if Labatt Brewery approached your gymnastics club and agreed to sponsor something but wanted their name all over the place, would you want to do it? Maybe not a good alignment, a good alignment of organizational values. So if you were to only take the fiduciary dimension to an approach by Labatt Brewery to sponsor or support the club, you would probably say yes, because financially it would look very good. But if you add that generative dimension, the club might decide, you know what, no, you know, this is not well aligned with us. So again, all three of these lenses are very important to consider when you're making board decisions, and none of them are inappropriate. Just because you've got a budget doesn't mean every decision in the organization should be made according to the expenses that have been allocated for the year. It's important to ask these other questions as well from time to time. So thank you for that. I'll pull the slideshow back up and look at the questions that I jotted down in advance. So fiduciary, what about insurance for the participants? Where does this fit in the budget? What are the risks? Who's responsible? And how is this going to be perceived by the community? Some strategic questions. Will this actually improve relationships with the business community? Do we need to improve relationships right now? What kind of precedent does this set? Are we now going to set ourselves up to get a whole bunch of requests for team building where we're losing money? Or do we want to pilot this as an opportunity to explore team building as a new revenue stream? So we'll pilot this one session, but then build out a framework and then start charging for it in the future. And okay, asking honestly, you know, what are the realistic connections that'll occur as a result of this session? Generative, how does this relate to who we are? Should this be a part of our overall strategy? Is it? Did we put as a strategic goal make relationships with the business community? If not, well, maybe we shouldn't even have this conversation. How much is corporate or business alignment and support for us overall? And could this be a new opportunity going forward? All right, so I was going to have us vote, but we're running a little bit short on time, so I'll skip this. It was just going to be out of interest to see where, you know, each of you would have voted on that question. Would you run the team building session or not? There is no, I don't think there's a right answer, because again, it depends on where the club is at. If forging relationships with the business community is really important and there's an upcoming fundraising campaign or something, maybe it would be a great activity, but maybe not. Maybe given everything happening in the club, and you know, maybe there's a big event competition that the competitive team is attending the coming weekend, that they cannot have their rotation schedule modified. So it's a non-starter, right? So there's no right answer. It depends on each situation. The important piece is that there's these three perspectives that can be applied to any decision. So asking yourselves right now, what board, you know, if you imagine a board meeting, which of those perspectives is, you know, the norm? How do decisions typically get framed? Secondly, you personally, where do you usually fall into those three? Where do you like to think? Are you a generative thinker? You like to ask the big tough questions, the big pie in the sky questions the crazy idea proposals, or are you more the fiduciary side of things? Hopefully your board has a mix of folks. And then what can you do to incorporate all three governance into your work, which is actually what we're going to get into in this next piece to this webinar. So we're now going to dive into some really exciting stuff, board meetings. This stuff, I say exciting because when I came across some of these frameworks and ideas for moving board meetings forward, I was very excited. And I've seen them, these have proven pretty valuable for organizations I've been involved with and with organizations that we've spoken with that have adopted these. So just a reminder, make sure to jot down, items that I'm going to go through that you're doing really well, and maybe some new items that you come across that you might want to put in place. Okay, I'm going to do another poll. I want you to describe your board meetings. Let's get a sense of how excited and engaging your board meetings are. So if you can look at these statements and let me know how you feel about your board meetings, that would be great. So first option, agendas are inspiring. We plan and use our time effectively is the second option. Third option, we have productive discussions. Fourth option, we regularly focus on big picture ideas. So as you're all enjoying your lunch, have a look at these options and put in, how do you feel about your board meetings? All right, 5 more seconds. We're going to close this. So a lot of folks saying productive discussions and make important decisions, which is great, and planning and using our time effectively. Well, that's terrific. So maybe my suggestions are already in place, which would be terrific. Okay, let's launch forward for some reason. So it's really important for meetings. The agenda is forward-looking, and I'll explain what that means in a second. There's a specific tool called a consent agenda that we espouse and suggest here at Vantage Point. But it is important that there is time and role discipline. So if the board, if you consider, 12 months of the year, 2-hour meetings, that's not a lot of hours in the year for the board to do everything it needs to do. So it's really important that board meetings don't get derailed, don't go off on tangents, that you focus on the most important items for the organization to consider. Okay, effective decision making and ideally full participation of all board members. The whole point of having a board is to benefit from multiple perspectives. All right, so if not everyone is heard to, you're missing out on the whole point of having a board of directors, a group of people in the first place. So we're going to go through 3 different tools. Okay, one is an annotated agenda, the second is a consent agenda, and we're gonna talk about those, and then a board calendar. All right, 3 really powerful tools to make sure your board meetings are, and I got the order backwards. The first one is a board calendar. Okay, this could be an absolutely invaluable tool in your board manual. It outlines it's literally each month of the year, the most important decision items that the board is going to have to make, and then who is involved in making that decision, whether it's a committee, a task force, whether it's heavily involved, staff are heavily involved, or other volunteers. Now, I want to emphasize one thing on here that you should take away from this. You'll note the agenda items are divided into 3 categories: decision, discussion, and information. These categories should also ideally be reflected on a board agenda. That can go a long way to ensuring effective conversations and effective decisions. So when somebody's asking a whole bunch of questions and going off on a long story and spending an hour in a meeting discussing something that's only an information item, this is a way to remind that person, you know what, John, this is only an information item this month. Next month, in February, we're going to actually discuss this, and then the decision is not until June. So we've got other items on the agenda. Can we please move forward? to the next item on the agenda, right? And if that's clearly communicated in a board calendar and on the agenda for each meeting, each of the items literally identifying whether it's an item for decision, whether it's intended for discussion, whereby it would be allocated a significant amount of time at the board meeting, or if it's only for information. And items for information usually consist of handouts that hopefully everybody's going to read beforehand, and it's not up to the board to get everybody up to speed before the board meeting. Outlining that in a board calendar is a great step to doing that. How to put this in place? The first step would be for the board chair to sit down with the senior staff person or senior staff people and start with the basic, okay, when is our gaming grant due? When is our AGM? Like put the absolute, the things that are not flexible, when do those items need to be in place? And then work backwards. Okay, given our AGM is in April, we need to approve financials in February, so the board should start looking at them in January, etc., right? And then you can add other items like your annual competitions and stuff like that. Emphasis here though, only items go on this calendar that involve the board. Okay, so this is not the entire organization's operational plan. This is just the items that require board review and specifically for decision, discussion, or for information. An annotated agenda takes the board calendar but builds it out a bit more specifically, and you would build one of these for each meeting. It outlines and makes distinctions between the reading that's required for a specific item, whether, again, the second item here, motion and discussion questions, so specifically outlining whether it's intended as a decision item or for discussion, and if it's for discussion, what is the specific question being asked, and then the concrete action. Are we making a decision about this, or are we just reviewing it for information? So here's what that looks like. You'll see the first column outlining exactly what the item is. Is it, again, one of these three categories? Is it only for information? In other words, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. Is it for discussion, whereby maybe we are going to spend some more time getting everybody up to speed? Or is it decision? And decision items, ideally, they've appeared on agendas for a number of months as discussion items. So something's been discussed a bunch of times, and okay, at this meeting, now we're going to move forward and make a final decision about this thing. All right, and then you see, so the item discussed at a high level, the background and the attachments. This can be very useful in a board meeting. And so to follow through, because in a board meeting, you can look at the two columns on the left-hand side, whereas before the board meeting, that's when everyone has a chance to look at, okay, what's the background around this? Okay, for this example, per Imagine Canada standards, so they need to look into that. But in a board meeting, they're not going to get into that detail. They maybe just refer to the item, okay, registered charity information returned. Has everybody looked at this stuff? Any questions, right? Okay, so that's an annotated agenda. Now the consent agenda. So here is a conventional board meeting agenda. You'll notice there's two things I want to highlight here. One is the complete absence of anything I just spoke about. So this does not distinguish whether anything on here is for decision, for discussion, or for information. It does not make that distinction. And it's also front-loaded or loaded at the front end with a bunch of stuff that's for information. Okay, that's put at the outset. At the bottom, you'll see this Southside Programs and Facility. Oh, so that's interesting. So you can put yourself in this board meeting thinking, okay, so call to order, we're going to talk about the minutes, we're going to get the executive director's report. And again, we don't know if any of these things are just for information or if the executive director actually needs a decision about any of these things. This is not clear from this agenda. Presumably, maybe these things are all just for information, and then a finance committee report. Then a presentation. Then we get into Southside Programs and Facility. Now in this example, that question around Southside Programs is a very important discussion. Unfortunately here, they're going to spend 2 hours reviewing the other stuff for information. They're going to be left with 15 minutes at the end to discuss this big, important item. And so unfortunately for them, most of the time will have been spent reviewing items for information, not discussing what is most important to this organization at the given time. So now here's the after screenshot. They have removed all of the items that are for information only into a consent agenda. Okay, and I'll repeat that again because it's important. They have built a consent agenda by removing anything that is for information only. So that's the first step in building a consent agenda, is to ask what in our agenda on our board meeting is only for information, that we don't need to talk about, that we don't need to make a decision about. Those get dumped into a consent agenda. At the beginning of the meeting, the chair says to the board, would anybody like to remove anything from the consent agenda? That's an opportunity for anybody on the board to say, no, you know what, this one item, I think we need to talk about that. Could we remove it? The Planning and Development Task Force in this example, we need to remove that because I want to talk about it. If nobody says anything, then the board chair says, can I have a motion to accept the consent agenda? Someone makes the motion, somebody seconds, all in favor, and then right away you proceed to the next item. You've accepted all these reports, the president's report accepted, the items that are for information in the minutes of the last meeting, right? Without spending time discussing them. And then they can dive right into that most important item from the agenda, the Southside Task Force. Then after that is the Finance Committee report. All right, so this is a consent agenda. It's a pretty bold move to put one of these in place. And because in one motion you can pass, executive director's report, you end up passing a whole bunch of stuff. And if you don't have anything in place like this right now, it can be a little bit difficult or fraught with, folks can be fraught with a little bit of anxiety around putting this in place if it's never been in place before. But again, in your board meetings, you shouldn't be spending a whole bunch of time discussing items for information. Most of your time should be spent reviewing discussion items and decision items. Okay, so this is just elaborating, so this emphasizes that second point. Now this agenda has the specific questions that the board is going to ask. So again, it's not an outline of vague and ambiguous items. It clarifies what the group is going to be talking about. Okay, this last point, putting on the oxygen mask. And I'm mindful of the time, and I'm going to take 5 more minutes for this webinar. So just a technical note, we'll take another 5 minutes. We are very close to the end, and we've gotten through the meaty stuff, and so I'll take 5 more minutes. After 5 minutes, I'll then give another 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll be at the end. All right, so if everybody has elsewhere to be, that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen next. It's really important that the board spends time outlining a career and discussing the role structure, to discuss how you recruit board members, how you support the education and development and orientation of board members, and how you go about recruitment for the future. Structure. So what committees do you have in place? Are they board committees or are they operational committees? All right, so this is really important for clarity in considering the organizational structure of the board. Before you go about recruitment, before you go about doing a board audit or revising board job descriptions, okay, what are the committees we have, who do they report to? We lean at Vantage Point towards not having standing committees or having as few standing committees as possible, to striking a task force, which is just a committee which has a distinct end, so a defined time frame. So they have a project with which they're tasked and then they will end. There are 3 committees that we do suggest as standing committees, but overall we suggest, your default should be to strike a task force, and if you really need to strike a more permanent standing committee, but only as a last resort. But then to ask the question, is this an operational committee to volunteer to help the ED or the other staff or the coaching staff carry out an event? So, you might have a committee that's tasked with carrying out the annual competition. Or is this an actual board committee to review our risk management policies, to review the budget, which would be the finance committee, right? That is a board committee. So making a clear distinction there is very important. The second one I've already mentioned, the distinction between a task force and a committee. A task force simply has a very specific project and an end date. So task forces do not, do not perpetuate indeterminately. They'll have an end. Advisory committees are a little bit tough because by their very nature, they're not delegated decision-making power. They're only entrusted to come up with recommendations and then to report those back, and then the board has the final say, and that could be a very frustrating situation if you sit in an advisory committee to suggest something to not see it move forward. Here are the 3 committees that we suggest. Board Development Committee, so this is the committee that would recruit prospective new board members, that would do the orientation and onboarding of the board. Okay, so when you've got new board members, how do they figure out what the club is all about? How do they learn about all the programs that are operating at the club? How do they learn about what happens at the board meetings? How do they learn what they're supposed to be reviewing for each board meeting? Okay, so the board development committee that's tasked with doing that. An executive director development committee, or this is also called a personnel committee. So this would be, the board delegates a committee to do the goal setting for the staff members. And then the finance committee to do that background and budget work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, going through the specific tasks each of these committees might do, but it is important. You should note each of these committees should have a terms of reference that is approved by the board. Okay, that's very important. We have templates of terms of reference if that's of interest to anybody. Okay, I already talked about task forces, so I'm not going to go into detail here. The emphasis here, dissolve when the job is done. Okay, so this can also be structured in a way that matches the time and the capacity. We like at Vantage Point to spend a little bit of time talking about board development. So ideally it's the board's role, and it shouldn't really, and I mean the head coach and the senior staff and management may be involved in orienting board members, but ideally the board itself, they take a bit of a role in doing that. So this is, okay, who's going to recruit new board members, and when we get new board members, who's going to provide the orientation for them? A board development committee to do that. It would also be the task of a board development committee to review the job descriptions of the board members, to review the board manual, okay, to disseminate that to the board, to make sure that the whole board is fulfilling their roles that are outlined in your board manual. Hopefully that's not just a one-person job. Hopefully you've got a couple people that work on that stuff, and it's the ideal task for a board development committee. Any board of any organization gets new board members all the time. How do they get educated? How do they learn about their role with the organization? How do they learn about their role overall as a board member? So is there some kind of process in place for board members to get up to speed on their legal duties as a board of directors? Maybe that's an informal pub night at the beginning of every year where someone who's been on the board for a long time explains that all to the other board members. Maybe you bring in an outside expert to give a session, and there's a million options in between those things, right? The emphasis is not on one specific way to do that, but in making sure that it does get carried out. The board, I mentioned earlier, has, individual board members have no specific decision-making power on their own. You only have decision-making authority as a collective, as a team. So it's important for that you can function as a team. If the whole board are complete strangers and have never met each other before, don't expect very tough decisions or discussions to take place in those first couple of board meetings. Everyone's just going to be really polite. They're just going to be getting to know one another. And so build in some time for that team building. Okay, no, you know what? The first two board meetings, it's not the place to start having a discussion, a strategic planning discussion around our vision, because no one even knows each other. So they're going to be just super polite. No one's going to ask the tough questions. Strategic planning, you want to ask the tough questions. And that's completely possible if everyone's comfortable with one another. If everyone's meeting for the first time, that's less possible. And maybe a pub night or a team building session at a park, or a retreat at somebody's house, spending the afternoon at somebody's house, just getting to know one another before you dive into the tough issues is important. This ties into the recruitment piece. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but if you write down for yourself, these are three important dimensions that need to happen for succession planning. Contingencies, so what happens if we lose someone, either the senior staff person or somebody on the board? How are we going to recruit on an ongoing basis? Building a pipeline for future board members, and what skills do we need for future prospective board members? For example, do we have a complete lack of anybody with any financial experience? I'm going to close here. Orientation is a process, not an event. And so especially for new board members, especially for board members who might be parents of children who just joined the program, they are going to have no information about how the club operates, what the culture of the board is, what programs the society operates. And again, as a board member, they need to know and make decisions for the club as a whole, not for one specific program. And so how are the board members getting to know one another on an ongoing basis? How are they onboarded at the outset? Oh, I lied, I got one more. Okay, board member handbook. These are a great outline of some items to go in the board member handbook. Again, this webinar is a great opportunity to consider those 8 roles that I outlined at the outset, and to consider, okay, are those referred to in our role descriptions in our letter of agreement? The board development committee, they would also be the ones to look at board policies and the organizational structure. Bylaws and constitution may be something a task force would undertake. Okay, most of these other slides I've already talked about this stuff. This refers to board retreats, regular meetings. We're now going to dive into some questions, and I already have one. Should the standing committees include the executive director or any other senior staff? It depends on the committee. So I would say, in the context of Gymnastics Club, a finance committee should absolutely include a senior staff person from the club. If it's a personnel development committee, Probably not. That would just be a board committee because they're reviewing the goals of the staff. They may, hopefully they want to sit down with the senior staff and discuss their goals for the year, their performance targets. But in terms of the structure of the committee, that person, those individuals not specifically sit on the committee. But yes, absolutely. For gymnastics clubs, like things like a finance committee or other committees that you might put in place on an ongoing basis, very appropriate to have the executive director again. Again, the senior staff person might be heavily involved in deciding those items, but the board has final approval over the board policies of the organization, over the bylaws and constitution. The executive director, they have zero liability or accountability for that stuff. All right, they may heavily influence that stuff. They are like 0% accountable for that. All right, so you need to take that away and remember that. Oh, and someone's asking, what are the 3 standing committees we recommended? Again, yeah, so finance committee, a board development committee to look at board recruitment, the board policies, the board structure overall, and how board orientation gets carried out. And then lastly, a personnel committee, okay, to review the senior staff. Okay, I'll give it 30 seconds for any other questions. Any other questions around any of this other craziness I just went through? Just a reminder, absolutely, pop us a note, Twitter, the handle is above, my email, mfreezin@thevantagepoint.ca, or just go to our website. My contact information is all there. Absolutely welcome any questions after the webinar. No problem at all in sending questions or answering questions afterwards. So with nothing else, refer back to your blooms, buds, and thorns. What are your next steps? I mentioned this reference to this book, so Governance is Leadership. That's the first reference here. This is a great video, Stanford School of Business. If you just type in or Google board governance, Stanford School. If you just Google something along those lines, you'll get this video. It's a pretty popular one, and it's a great outline of some of the topics I just went through. That is absolutely applicable to gymnastics clubs. Please, if everybody could right now in the chat box, we've entered a survey, and it's really helpful and valuable if you could all fill that out. I've got 0 feedback because I cannot see any of your faces, so I don't know if any of this stuff was landing, whether you're going to take this away and you're off to the races, or whether you were really challenged to consider how this is appropriate. It is really instrumental in value. If you could all take a moment and fill out the survey at this link in the chat box, that would be really, really appreciated for both Vantage Point and for Gymnastics BC. So I'd ask everyone to do that right now, because if you don't do it now, it's unlikely to happen. And again, really important for webinars especially, because I don't get the benefit of seeing the looks on your faces to see how this stuff is landing. So that is in the GoToWebinar in the chat box on the top right of your screen. There's a link there. And if you could fill that out, that would be terrific. The next webinar, the last of the series of 3 webinars we have with Gymnastics BC, critical role of the board chair. So I'm hopeful, and for that one, we are going to revert back to the format we had for the first webinar, where we're going to have some one or more guest speakers. So it won't just be me on the last one, where there'll be a bunch of us, hopefully myself and 2 others, to discuss, the role of the board, because it is, pardon me, the role of the chair on the board, because it is distinct from other board members and it is important. So thank you, everyone. We will close it there. The recording will be made available to watch and share with your colleagues. And if you haven't done so, please do click on that link. It's really instrumental and valuable to us to get feedback.